The Franklin County Courthouse is a monument of stone and solemnity, its halls designed to echo with the weight of consequence. On the crisp morning of Ethan Walker's trial, the air inside was thick with a silence that felt heavier than sound. It was a silence filled with anticipation, with grief, and with the chilling curiosity that draws a community together in the wake of an unthinkable crime. In the front row of the gallery sat the family of David Campbell, their faces etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed to have carved new lines into their skin. They were a portrait of loss, a silent, constant testament to the life that had been stolen. Across the aisle, at a polished defense table, sat the reason they were all there. At just 17 years old, Ethan Walker should have looked like a child swallowed by a system too vast for him to comprehend. Dressed in a borrowed suit a size too large, he appeared physically small, almost fragile. But his demeanor was anything but. As the legal teams arranged their files and the jury settled into their seats, Ethan surveyed the scene not with the terror of a young man facing a murder charge, but with the detached, critical eye of a theater critic attending a premiere. He was a performer, and this was his stage. He seemed to be studying the architecture of the room, the somber faces of the jury, the barely contained anguish of his victim's family. And as his gaze swept across the gallery, it was clear he was looking for something. Not sympathy, not an ally, but an audience. It was in these moments, when he thought the focus was elsewhere, that the mask would shift. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk would play at the corners of his mouth. It was not a smile of humor or of nervousness. It was a grin of profound, unnerving confidence, a look of contempt. It was the expression of someone who believed he was untouchable, the smartest person in a room full of fools. This was the central, chilling mystery of the case before it even began. It wasn't about guilt or innocence. The evidence was overwhelming. It was about the void. How could a 17-year-old boy, in the face of such a grave proceeding, show not a flicker of remorse? How could he look at the family of the man he had brutally murdered and feel nothing but a cold, arrogant amusement? This trial would become more than a legal formality. It would be a psychological dissection, a painstaking attempt to understand the nature of the evil that sat at the defense table smiling. The prosecutors knew they weren't just trying a murder case. They were tasked with proving the existence of a monster whose most damning evidence would be his own performance on this very stage. And as the trial would later prove, the most devastating testimony, the one that would finally shatter his illusion of control, would come not from a detective or an expert witness, but from the one person who had been his first audience, his first enabler and his final judge, his own mother. Maple Creek Lane was the kind of street that existed as an unspoken promise. A promise of safety, of community, of a predictable and gentle rhythm of life. On the evening of October 12th, that promise was bathed in the crisp, golden light of a perfect Ohio autumn. Leaves of amber and crimson skittered across manicured lawns under the sterile, comforting glow of streetlights. Each home was a small fortress of warmth and routine, a sanctuary against the encroaching darkness. Inside his modest two-story house, 52-year-old David Campbell was settling in for the night. The faint aroma of a late dinner still lingered in the air. He was a man of quiet habits and simple pleasures, a high school history teacher who had spent 3 decades shaping young minds with stories of the past, utterly unaware that his own story was about to reach its brutal and senseless conclusion. David had lived in this house for nearly 20 years. His life was a testament to stability and kindness, a fixture in the community known for his meticulously kept garden and his willingness to lend a hand to any neighbor in need. That night, the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of the wind, a peaceful symphony that gave no warning of the violence to come. The tranquility of the neighborhood was an illusion. A thin veneer stretched over a darkness that was about to rupture the community's sense of safety. The attack was not a robbery gone wrong or an act of passionate rage. It was an intrusion of pure, unmotivated malice. An event so savage it would leave investigators searching for a reason that simply did not exist. The first official record of the tragedy came at 10:47 p.m., logged as a terse, anonymous 911 call reporting screams from the Campbell residence. The dispatcher heard only a few panicked words before the line went dead. A chilling silence that prompted the immediate dispatch of 2 patrol cars. Officers arrived within minutes to a scene of unsettling normalcy. The porch light was on, a newspaper lay on the welcome mat, and there were no visible signs of forced entry. It was only when they peered through a side window into the living room that the illusion shattered, revealing a scene of such profound violence that it would be seared into their memories for the rest of their careers. Inside, David Campbell lay on the floor, his life extinguished in a brutal, chaotic struggle that had overturned furniture and left crimson stains upon the pale beige carpet. The sheer savagery of the attack was immediately apparent, far exceeding what was necessary to subdue a single man, suggesting a rage that was both personal and deeply pathological. The initial search of the home yielded no immediate motive. His wallet was on the kitchen counter with cash still inside, and valuable electronics remained untouched, systematically dismantling the theory of a simple burglary. The only thing taken from the house was a life, leaving behind a vacuum of grief and 1,000 unanswered questions that would soon fall to the Westerville Police Department to answer. This was a trophy killing in its purest form, an act committed solely for the perpetrator's own twisted gratification, and the detectives knew their investigation would not be about following the money, but about tracking the monster responsible for such a pointless act of destruction. The investigation into the murder of David Campbell began as a frustrating search for a ghost. Detectives moved through a world of maybes and dead ends, chasing shadows that dissolved under the harsh light of scrutiny. They interviewed dozens of people, friends, colleagues, former students, and neighbors. A consistent portrait emerged of a man universally liked, a gentle soul with no known enemies, no gambling debts, no secret life. This only deepened the mystery. The absence of a motive was a particular kind of torture, as it denied them the comfort of a logical narrative, leaving them to grapple with the terrifying knowledge that such profound evil could exist without reason or warning. The city of Westerville held its breath, gripped by the fear of a random, unseen killer who could strike anyone at any time. For 2 days, the investigation languished in uncertainty. But in a world of digital footprints and constant surveillance, hiding from a crime of this magnitude had become an almost impossible task. The break in the case came not from a mysterious informant's tip or a complex forensic puzzle, but from the mundane, ubiquitous technology of a neighbor's doorbell camera. The device, positioned across the street from David Campbell's home, was installed not to solve a murder, but to deter package thieves. Yet it had captured a grainy but clear image of a lone figure walking away from the house at approximately 10:35 p.m., just minutes before the 911 call was made. The individual was young, dressed in dark clothing, and moved with a casual, unhurried gait that was chillingly at odds with the horror that had just unfolded inside. This was their ghost, a digital specter captured in a handful of pixels. Detectives spent the next 48 hours in a painstaking process of digital forensics, a modern-day manhunt conducted not on the streets, but in the glowing light of computer monitors. They cross-referenced the image with local school yearbooks, social media profiles, and driver's license databases. They canvassed the neighborhood, showing the blurry image to residents, hoping for a flicker of recognition. Slowly, the ghost began to take shape. A name began to surface, first as a possibility, then as a probability. Ethan Walker. He was a 17-year-old high school senior who lived just a few blocks away, a teenager known among his peers for petty delinquency and a simmering, defiant arrogance, but nothing that would have suggested a capacity for such extreme violence. The final confirmation was a gut-wrenching twist. A search of school records revealed that 2 years prior, Ethan Walker had been a student in David Campbell's 10th grade history class. This fact added a disturbing layer of familiarity to the crime, transforming it from a random act into something chillingly personal. With a positive identification from multiple sources, the Westerville police obtained a search warrant for the Walker residence and an arrest warrant for Ethan, preparing to confront the young man whose digital image was now the focal point of their homicide investigation. The arrest was executed on a crisp Thursday morning. The tactical team descended on the Walkers' modest suburban home with a quiet, practiced efficiency. There was no dramatic standoff, no chase. Ethan's father answered the door, his face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into dawning horror as he read the warrant. Ethan was found in his bedroom, bathed in the blue glow of a television screen, the sounds of simulated gunfire from a video game filling the small space. He looked up at the officers who flooded his room not with fear or surprise, but with a look of bored annoyance, as if their intrusion was merely an inconvenient interruption. The armor of his adolescent detachment was impenetrable. He offered no resistance as he was handcuffed, his eyes empty of any discernible emotion. During the search of his room, detectives found the evidence that would forge an unbreakable link between Ethan Walker and the murder of David Campbell. Tucked away in a laundry hamper were a pair of sneakers, their soles stained with a faint reddish-brown that lab technicians would later confirm was a perfect match for the victim's blood. A black hoodie matching the one seen in the doorbell camera footage was found stuffed under his mattress. The most damning discovery, however, was a decorative knife missing from a collection on his dresser, a fantasy-style blade whose unique serrated edge was consistent with some of the wounds documented in the autopsy report. The physical evidence was overwhelming, a silent, irrefutable chorus of testimony against the blank-faced teenager who now sat in the back of a police cruiser, watching his life recede in the rearview mirror. The interrogation began later that morning in a small, windowless room at the police headquarters, a sterile environment designed to amplify psychological pressure. Ethan sat slouched in his chair, his demeanor a study in adolescent apathy, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just above the detective's head. His parents had invoked his right to an attorney, but before the lawyer arrived, Ethan, with a misplaced confidence in his own intelligence, waived his right to remain silent, eager to engage in what he clearly perceived as a game of wits. He seemed to believe he could outsmart the seasoned detectives, a fatal miscalculation born of a deeply ingrained narcissism and a profound underestimation of the system he was now facing. The initial questioning was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, with the lead detective adopting a calm, almost paternal tone. He did not accuse. He asked questions, circling the event without ever directly addressing it, allowing Ethan to build his own scaffold of lies. Ethan claimed he was home all night, that he knew nothing about the incident, his answers delivered with a rehearsed smoothness that betrayed their falsehood. He leaned back in his chair, affecting an air of casual indifference, but a slight, persistent tapping of his foot betrayed a flicker of nervous energy beneath the placid surface. The turning point came when the detectives laid a single photograph on the table between them, a still frame from the neighbor's doorbell camera, clear and undeniable. It was a simple, powerful move, the first crack in Ethan's carefully constructed facade of invincibility. His casual posture tightened, his eyes darting from the picture to the faces of the detectives. The faint smirk he had been wearing finally dissolved. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion, not remorse, but anger at being caught, flashed across his face. With his alibi shattered, Ethan's demeanor underwent a chilling transformation. The pretense of innocence fell away, replaced by a cold, matter-of-fact confession delivered without a trace of guilt or regret. He described breaking into David Campbell's house through an unlocked back window, not to steal, but because he was bored. He recounted the confrontation, the ensuing struggle, and the act of violence itself, his voice a flat monotone as if he were describing a scene from one of his video games. There was no emotional inflection, no hesitation, no hint that he was talking about ending a human life. It was this complete and utter absence of empathy, this chilling void where a conscience should have been, that was more shocking to the detectives than the brutal details of the crime itself. His confession was not a cry for help or a release of a terrible burden. It was a boast, the proud, unrepentant admission of a monster. With Ethan Walker's chilling confession recorded, the case was handed over to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. Leading the prosecution was Assistant District Attorney Olivia Rodriguez, a seasoned prosecutor known for her meticulous preparation and commanding presence in the courtroom. She understood that a confession, no matter how damning, was only one piece of the puzzle, especially when dealing with a juvenile defendant whose statement could be challenged in court on grounds of coercion or a lack of understanding of his rights. Her primary objective was to build a case so overwhelmingly fortified with independent evidence that it would be impervious to any legal assaults from the defense. She intended to construct a fortress of fact around Ethan Walker, with his confession serving not as the foundation, but as the final decorative spire. The first step for Rodriguez and her team was to methodically catalog and analyze every piece of physical evidence. The bloodstained sneakers were sent for DNA analysis, which came back with a 1 in a billion match to David Campbell, irrefutably placing Ethan at the scene of the crime. The unique serrations on the fantasy knife found in Ethan's room were compared to the wound patterns documented in the detailed autopsy report. Using advanced imaging software, forensic pathologists created a three-dimensional model of the wounds, revealing a perfect correspondence that identified it as the murder weapon beyond any reasonable doubt. Furthermore, microscopic fibers from David Campbell's wool sweater were found on the cuffs of Ethan's black hoodie, a crucial piece of trace evidence that documented the close, violent proximity of the struggle. Rodriguez knew that juries responded to tangible scientific proof, and she was assembling an arsenal of forensic certainty. While the forensic team worked, investigators delved deeper into Ethan Walker's background, searching for the psychological context that would explain his monstrous act. They conducted dozens of interviews with teachers, classmates, and neighbors, and a disturbing portrait began to emerge. He was described as intelligent but deeply antisocial, a young man who exhibited a profound lack of empathy and a penchant for casual cruelty. Former teachers recalled a student who was academically capable but contemptuous of authority, who would subtly mock other students' failures. Classmates spoke of a loner who wasn't shy, but disdainful, who saw social interactions as games to be manipulated rather than connections to be made. Several recalled instances of him bullying weaker students or his disturbing, detached accounts of torturing small animals. This psychological profile was crucial for the prosecution, as it would help them counter the inevitable defense narrative of a troubled child who made a single terrible mistake. The most significant legal battle of the pretrial phase was the motion to transfer Ethan Walker's case from juvenile to adult court. Olivia Rodriguez argued passionately before Judge James Harris, presenting evidence of the crime's extreme brutality and Ethan's profound lack of remorse as indicators that he was beyond the rehabilitative scope of the juvenile system. She played excerpts from his taped confession, allowing his flat, emotionless voice to fill the courtroom, a chilling testament to his psychological state. She also introduced his sealed juvenile record, which, while not containing felony charges, detailed a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior, vandalism, truancy, and documented instances of cruelty to animals that painted a clear picture of a developing predator. After 2 days of hearings, Judge Harris delivered his ruling. He acknowledged the defense's arguments about Ethan's age, but ultimately found that the sheer brutality of the crime and the defendant's complete and utter lack of empathy warranted his trial as an adult. The decision was a major victory for the prosecution, ensuring that when Ethan Walker faced a jury, he would be judged not as a child, but as a man facing the full weight of the law. How does a child become a monster? And how does that monster learn to hide behind the innocent face of a 17-year-old boy? This was the question that would haunt the city of Westerville, a question born from an act of violence so depraved it seemed to defy all logic. The crime was not a product of youthful anger or a fleeting moment of bad judgment. It was the calculated and sadistic work of a predator who had been honing his dark desires in secret for years. The victim, David Campbell, was not chosen for any reason other than his availability, a random target selected to satisfy an unspeakable hunger for power and control. The investigation took a dark and heartbreaking turn when detectives began to dig into Ethan's past, and what they discovered was a pattern of escalating cruelty that had been ignored or dismissed at every turn. They found evidence that Ethan had a hidden history of torturing neighborhood animals, acts of sadism that were a classic precursor to violence against humans. Neighbors recounted stories of missing pets and finding small animals mutilated in the woods, incidents they never imagined were linked to the quiet teenager down the street. The most damning discovery, however, was a series of ignored warnings. Teachers had noted his disturbing essays and lack of emotional connection to peers. His own parents had dismissed these red flags as phases, protecting him from the consequences of his actions time and again. The system, both at home and at school, had failed to see the monster it was helping to create. This history became a central pillar of Olivia Rodriguez's case. She argued that this was not a sudden, inexplicable act of violence, but the predictable outcome of a pattern of systemic enablement. The parents, blinded by denial, had refused to see the darkness growing in their own son. The prosecution team meticulously pieced together this timeline of escalating cruelty, creating a narrative that was both horrifying and undeniable. They presented testimony from child psychologists who explained that for a psychopath like Ethan, these early acts were rehearsals for the ultimate thrill of killing a human. He was a predator in training, and his community had been his unwitting enablers, providing him with the time and privacy he needed to perfect his craft. The first day of the trial of the state of Ohio versus Ethan Walker dawned cold and gray, the weather a fitting reflection of the solemn proceedings about to unfold. The courtroom was packed, a tense and somber assembly of media, legal professionals, and members of the public drawn in by the case's brutal nature. On one side of the room sat the family of David Campbell, their faces etched with a grief that had not subsided in the months since his death, their presence a silent, constant reminder of the human cost of the crime. On the other side, at the defense table, sat Ethan Walker. His trial began, and with it, his performance. From the moment he entered the courtroom, it was clear he viewed the proceedings not as a reckoning, but as a stage. While the prosecutor, Olivia Rodriguez, delivered a powerful opening statement, detailing the horrific evidence, Ethan stifled a theatrical yawn, a clear projection of his profound boredom. When his own lawyer, Michael Clark, rose to speak, painting a picture of a troubled and psychologically tormented youth, Ethan offered a small, dismissive shake of his head, a gesture visible to the entire jury box. He did not believe a word of his own defense. He fidgeted with his tie, whispered audibly to his lawyer, and scanned the faces in the gallery with an air of detached amusement, his smirk occasionally widening into a full-blown grin when he caught someone's eye. The contrast between the solemnity of the proceedings and the defendant's casual demeanor was a chasm that grew wider with each passing moment. The jury, a captive audience to this display, watched him with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. His behavior was not just disrespectful. It was alien, a complete rejection of the social and moral contract that governed the courtroom and the world outside it. Michael Clarke's carefully constructed narrative of a broken boy was crumbling before his eyes, being replaced by the far more compelling and terrifying reality that Olivia Rodriguez had promised. The reality of a killer who simply did not care. This chilling performance reached its first crescendo during the testimony of the medical examiner. As the expert detailed the 28 separate stab wounds inflicted upon David Campbell, Ethan was seen whispering to his lawyer and letting out a small, quiet laugh. The sound, though barely audible, was seen by several members of the jury and the victim's family. Amelia Sanchez, David Campbell's sister, had to be escorted from the courtroom, her composure finally breaking under the dual weight of the graphic testimony and the defendant's sickening disrespect. Her choked sobs were a stark counterpoint to Ethan's casual indifference, a moment of raw human grief that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Judge Harris paused the proceedings, his eyes fixed on Ethan with a look of undisguised contempt. He issued a stern warning, his voice low and dangerous, but the warnings had no effect. Ethan was in his own world, immune to the authority of the court and the pain of others. The trial had just begun, but the most powerful evidence against Ethan Walker was already on full display. While Ethan Walker commanded the courtroom's attention with his chilling performance, someone else was watching with a dawning and unbearable horror. In the public gallery, sitting behind the prosecution team, was his mother, Elizabeth Walker. Every smirk, every whispered joke, every display of casual indifference from her son landed on her not just as an act of disrespect, but as a confirmation of a truth she had spent a lifetime avoiding. She listened as the defense attorney her family had hired, Michael Clarke, tried to build a fragile narrative of a broken boy, a victim of neglect and a troubled home life. It was a standard, competent defense, but to Elizabeth every word was a lie. She knew the truth. Ethan had not been neglected. He had been enabled. He had not been abandoned. He had been protected. For weeks, she sat in silence, a storm of guilt and terror brewing within her. She watched her son, this stranger in a suit, perform his monstrosity for the world, and she recognized the gestures, the manipulative charm, the cold emptiness in his eyes. These were not new developments. They were the fully grown fruits of a seed she had allowed to be planted long ago. She saw the pain on the faces of the Campbell family, a pain she knew, on some deep, unspoken level, she had helped to create. The internal conflict became a torment. Her maternal instinct, the primal urge to protect her child, was at war with a lifetime of repressed knowledge. She remembered the small cruelties she had explained away, the lies she had told on his behalf, the escalating pattern of disturbing behavior she had willfully ignored. She was trapped between the mother she had tried to be and the witness she knew she had to become. The defense's strategy depended on her. Michael Clarke had planned to call her as his final, most powerful witness. He prepped her for weeks, coaching her to deliver a tearful, humanizing portrait of her son, to speak of the sweet child he once was before he became lost to his inner demons. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy, a last-ditch effort to appeal to the jury's emotions. But in a private conference just before she was due to take the stand, Elizabeth finally broke. She confessed to a stunned Michael Clarke that she could not, in good conscience, deliver the narrative he had crafted. The performance of her son in court had been the final, horrifying catalyst. It had forced her to confront the truth. The boy she had raised was a stranger to her, a chilling enigma whose depths she was only now beginning to comprehend. The loving mother was gone, replaced by a woman with a terrible and necessary choice to make. The trial seemed to be moving toward its inevitable conclusion. The prosecution had presented an overwhelming case. The defense was preparing to rest after their primary strategy had been undermined by the defendant himself. But just as Judge Harris was about to address the lawyers, a figure stood up in the gallery. It was Elizabeth Walker, Ethan's mother. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but her posture was resolute. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but clear enough to command the room's attention. "I need to speak." A wave of confusion swept through the courtroom. Michael Clarke shot to his feet, objecting immediately, stating that the defense had already rested its case and that he had not called Mrs. Walker to the stand. Olivia Rodriguez, though taken aback, remained silent, sensing that something of immense gravity was about to happen. Judge Harris looked down at the distraught woman, his expression a mixture of judicial sternness and human curiosity. He knew this was highly irregular, a breach of standard courtroom procedure, but he also saw in her eyes a desperation that transcended legal protocol. "On what grounds do you wish to address the court?" the judge asked, his voice even. "On the grounds of the truth," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "The whole truth. Not the story my son's lawyer wanted me to tell. Not the story I have been telling myself for years. The truth about who my son is and what I helped him become." The courtroom was utterly silent. Ethan stared at his mother, the smirk finally gone from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury. This was a betrayal he had not anticipated. After a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Judge Harris nodded slowly. "The court will allow it," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Mrs. Walker, you may approach the witness stand." Elizabeth Walker walked to the stand as if in a trance. She took the oath, her hand trembling as she swore to tell the truth. Her testimony was not a structured narrative, but a torrent of painful memories, a flood of repressed guilt and dawning horror. She dismantled, piece by painful piece, the defense's narrative of a broken boy who was a victim of neglect. She told the court that Ethan had not been neglected. He had been enabled. From a very young age, he had displayed a chilling lack of empathy, and she had consistently made excuses for him. She recounted how she had explained away his torturing of neighborhood pets as childish curiosity. She admitted to lying to teachers, to principals, and even to the police to protect him from the consequences of his increasingly disturbing behavior. "I didn't want to see it," she said, her voice cracking with self-recrimination. "I wanted to believe he was just a difficult child, that he would grow out of it. I told myself that if I just loved him enough, he would be okay. But my love wasn't love. It was poison. I built him a world with no consequences, and I taught him that he was entitled to do whatever he wanted, because he was special." Her words were a devastating indictment of her own parenting, a raw and honest admission of her role in the creation of the monster sitting at the defense table. She turned her gaze from the prosecutor and looked directly at the jury, her eyes pleading for them to understand. "His lawyer told you he is a broken boy, but that's not the truth. The truth is he is a broken thing. I know, because I'm the one who broke him." The impact of Elizabeth Walker's testimony was seismic. It was not new physical evidence, but it was the missing piece of the psychological puzzle, the Rosetta Stone that translated Ethan's baffling behavior into a clear and terrifying language. She had not excused her son. She had explained him, and in doing so, she had obliterated the last shred of sympathy anyone in the room might have felt for him. Michael Clark sat slumped in his chair, his face ashen, his defense in ruins around him. He had been utterly and completely blindsided, his case destroyed not by the prosecution, but by the one person he had counted on to save it. Ethan Walker's reaction was volcanic. The cold, controlled facade he had maintained for months finally shattered into a million pieces. He lunged forward, his chair screeching against the polished floor, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You're lying," he screamed, his voice a raw, guttural roar that bore no resemblance to the bored teenager from moments before. "You lying bitch! I hate you!" He fought against the grip of the bailiffs who quickly moved to restrain him, his body thrashing with a wild, impotent fury. The jury stared, their faces a mixture of shock and horror, as they watched the final, terrifying transformation. The smirking, arrogant defendant was gone, replaced by the raging, unhinged animal his mother had just described. The breaking point had finally come, not from the weight of justice, but from the ultimate narcissistic injury, the betrayal of the one person whose approval and protection he had always taken for granted. This was not the calculated performance of a criminal mastermind. It was the raw, uncontrolled tantrum of a spoiled child whose primary enabler had just abandoned him. Judge Harris slammed his gavel, his own face a mask of cold fury, ordering the bailiffs to remove the defendant from the courtroom. Ethan continued to scream obscenities as he was dragged away, his voice echoing in the hallway long after the doors had swung shut. The courtroom was left in a state of stunned silence, the air thick with the aftershock of the explosion they had just witnessed. The jury, who had watched his smug performance for days, now saw the unchained rage beneath. His mother hadn't just testified against him. She had taken away his power, his control. She had shown the world the truth. A truth so ugly that even he could no longer hide from it behind a condescending smirk. The mask was not just shattered. It had been pulverized, leaving nothing but the hideous, snarling face of a killer. The final day of the trial was a mere formality. The verdict had already been decided, not by legal rhetoric, but by the raw, undeniable truth of a mother's testimony and her son's subsequent explosion of rage. Closing arguments were delivered, but the jury's minds were clearly made up. Olivia Rodriguez's closing was brief and powerful. She simply recounted the evidence and reminded the jury of Elizabeth Walker's devastating confession, concluding, "His own mother showed you the monster. Now it is your duty to hold that monster accountable." Michael Clark, looking defeated, offered a short, subdued statement, a final futile plea for a mercy he knew was no longer possible. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The speed of their decision was a testament to the overwhelming certainty of the case. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were grim and resolute. The foreman handed the verdict to the clerk, who read it aloud in a clear, steady voice. "On the charge of aggravated murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Walker, guilty." A wave of quiet relief washed over the side of the courtroom where the Campbell family sat, while a heavy, final silence fell over the defense table. Ethan, now dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and flanked by two burly deputies, showed no emotion. The rage from the previous day had subsided, replaced by a cold, unnerving stillness. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was once again filled for the sentencing hearing. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of finality. Judge James Harris, a man known for his stern but fair judicial temperament, entered the room and took his seat, his gaze immediately falling upon the defendant. He had presided over hundreds of trials in his long career, but this case, he knew, was different. Before passing sentence, he addressed the court, his voice a low, powerful rumble that commanded absolute attention. He spoke of the profound loss of David Campbell, a man who represented the very best of their community. He then turned his attention directly to Ethan Walker. "For weeks," the judge said, his eyes boring into the defendant, "you have sat in this courtroom with an air of contempt and arrogance that I have rarely witnessed. You have smirked at the victim's grieving family. You have laughed at the evidence of your own monstrous actions. You have treated the most solemn process of our justice system as if it were a game designed for your personal amusement." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. "Your attorney argued that you were a product of a broken home. But I do not believe that to be the truth. The truth, I believe, was spoken from that witness stand by your own mother. She told us she created a world for you where consequences did not exist. Today, Mr. Walker, that world ends." The judge's voice was cold, hard, and unforgiving, the embodiment of the system Ethan had so profoundly underestimated. "Your mother's testimony was not a plea for mercy. It was a warning. It was the final, desperate act of a woman who understood the danger you posed to the world because she understood, better than anyone, the emptiness inside you. This court will heed that warning." Judge Harris then delivered the sentence, his words falling like a hammer in the silent courtroom. "For the crime of aggravated murder, this court sentences you, Ethan Walker, to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A collective, quiet gasp went through the gallery. It was the maximum sentence possible, a clear and unambiguous declaration that Ethan Walker would never again walk free. It was in that precise moment, as the finality of the words, without the possibility of parole, echoed through the room, that the armor of Ethan's arrogance finally irrevocably shattered. The smirk, the defiance, the cold detachment. It all dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of raw, uncomprehending panic. His face went slack, his eyes wide with a terror that was shockingly real. It was the look of a narcissist whose delusion of invincibility had just collided with an immovable object. It was the dawning horror of a person who had never faced a true consequence in his entire life suddenly being confronted with the ultimate one. The game was over and he had lost. As the bailiffs moved in to lead him away, his composure crumbled completely. A choked, strangled sob escaped his lips, the first genuine sound of emotion he had displayed in the entire process. It was not a sob of remorse for David Campbell. It was a sob of pure, selfish terror for himself. He began to struggle weakly against the deputies, his eyes darting around the courtroom as if searching for an escape that did not exist. His mother watched him go, her face a mask of stone, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. She had given him life, and now she had borne witness to its effective end. As the heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind him, sealing his fate, the laughter that had once echoed in the halls of justice was replaced by the sound of a monster, finally and fully understanding the meaning of defeat. The empty grin was gone, leaving only the hollow reality of a life sentence, and a community left to ponder how a quiet street in Ohio could produce such a chilling, human void.